You are about to get into your car, you put the key in, or maybe you just press a button. The engine starts, you don't think twice. But somewhere in that car, buried inside the battery, the motor, the sensors, the steering system are materials that passed through one country before they ever reached you. One country that right now holds the power to make that car more expensive, harder to build, or impossible to replace. And it didn't need to fire a single shot to get there. China controls the supply chain for the minerals that make your car move. Not some of it, most of it. And in 2025, it started pulling the lever. Here is what that means for you, your wallet, and the vehicle sitting in your driveway right now. To understand this, you need to understand what is actually inside a modern car, especially an electric one. Electric vehicles use 6 times more rare earth minerals than a conventional gasoline car. That is not a small difference. That is the entire foundation of the power shift happening right now. The key minerals are lithium, cobalt, graphite, nickel, manganese, and rare earth elements like neodymium, dysprosium, and terbium. These are not interchangeable. There is no substitute sitting on a shelf somewhere. Each one performs a specific function inside the battery or the motor that nothing else can replicate without major cost or major performance loss, and China refines almost all of them. According to the International Energy Agency's Global Critical Minerals Outlook 2025, China is the dominant refiner for 19 out of 20 key strategic minerals, holding an average market share of around 70%. For rare earth elements, that number climbs above 90%. For graphite, China controls 100% of global processing capacity. Every piece of graphite bound for a battery anywhere in the world runs through Chinese facilities first. Think about that for a moment. Australia has raw graphite in the ground. Mozambique has it. Madagascar has it. But without Chinese processing plants, those minerals cannot become the anode inside your car's battery. The resource is one thing. The refining is the actual weapon. John Helveston, an electric vehicle expert at George Washington University, put it plainly. Even if a battery is assembled in a plant in the United States, the raw materials for that battery were processed and refined in China first. The starting point is always the same. Now, for decades, this was treated as an inconvenience, a supply chain quirk, something the market would eventually sort out. Then, 2025 happened. On April 4th, the Chinese government introduced export controls on 7 heavy rare earth elements, including all related compounds, metals, and magnets. The effect was immediate. Shipments dropped sharply in April and May. Carmakers in the United States, Europe, and elsewhere scrambled to find permanent magnets. Some factories cut production rates, some temporarily shut down entirely. When supply recovered, the price did not follow it back down. According to the IEA, European prices for rare earth elements reached up to 6 times the price of the same minerals inside China. That cost gap does not disappear, it gets passed down the chain. It eventually reaches the price tag on the car you are looking at in a showroom, and China was not finished. On October 9, 2025, the Ministry of Commerce announced a second, broader wave of controls. This time, they covered not just raw materials, but also battery cells, cathode precursors, anode materials, lithium iron phosphate cathodes, and the manufacturing equipment and technologies used to produce all of them. And the most significant detail buried inside those new rules, the one that almost nobody outside a few trading desks noticed, was this. From December 1st, the controls were set to extend to internationally made products that contain Chinese-sourced materials or were manufactured using Chinese technology. In other words, even something built in Germany or South Korea using Chinese origin materials could require an export license from Beijing. That is not a trade rule, that is a chokehold. The US currently imports over 95% of its rare earth elements from China. It is 100% dependent on imports for refined nickel products and battery-grade manganese sulfate. There is no domestic pipeline waiting in reserve. Building a rare earth refinery from scratch takes 2 to 5 years at minimum. Australia approved its first lithium refinery in 2016, and it did not produce a single unit of lithium until 2022. 6 years. And that was without a trade war, making every step harder. Meanwhile, China's dominance in the downstream battery supply chain is even more concentrated than the raw mineral picture suggests. According to research from Contrary, China holds 85% of global battery cell manufacturing capacity. It controls 92% of the anode materials market, 78% of battery electrolytes, and 70% each of separators and cathode materials. Companies like CATL, the world's largest battery manufacturer, have spent decades building vertical integration and institutional knowledge that simply cannot be recreated in a few years by a competitor starting from zero. And they are not standing still. BYD, which began as a battery manufacturer for consumer electronics and then pivoted to electric vehicles, now controls most of its own supply chain end to end. These are not companies reacting to a market. These are companies that were building the infrastructure for this moment decades in advance. So what does this mean for your car? If China tightens controls further, or if the current export restrictions stay in place for a sustained period, battery prices globally could rise dramatically. The IEA has modeled what happens if battery metal prices spike fivefold due to a supply disruption. The answer is a 20% increase in average battery pack prices worldwide. If prices spike tenfold, battery costs rise 40 to 50%. That translates directly into more expensive electric vehicles at precisely the moment that governments are trying to push consumers toward buying them. The US government has responded. An executive order in March 2025 called for immediate measures to increase American mineral production, aimed at expediting permits and directing investment into domestic critical mineral projects. Battery manufacturing capacity in the US has doubled since 2022 following tax credits for producers under the Inflation Reduction Act. The Pentagon has used the Defense Production Act to fund domestic rare earth projects, but none of this produces minerals tomorrow. None of it replaces Chinese refining capacity next year. And even the most optimistic projections from the IEA show China remaining the dominant refined supplier for almost all key minerals through at least 2035. For graphite and rare earths specifically, if China were removed from the equation entirely, the remaining global supply would cover only 35 to 40% of remaining demand. That is the gap. That is the leverage. Economic historian Adam Tooze of Columbia University framed the stakes clearly in 2025. If fossil fuels heralded the Industrial Revolution with the West leading it, the green energy transition is clearly being led by Asia, with China as its global leader. The green future runs through China's supply chain, and right now China controls the valve. So the next time you press the button that starts your car, the engine hums. You do not think twice. But somewhere in that motor, those rare earth magnets that spin it to life came from a supply chain that one country has spent 40 years building, controlling, and is now quietly and methodically learning to use as a weapon. You did not need to fire a single shot to win that kind of war. You just needed to own the infrastructure that everyone else forgot to build.